All right, today I'm actually going to be joined by an old coach of mine, someone who I kind of grew up and he was my track and field coach, and he used to always go the extra mile. Sometimes that was literally running an extra mile with us, but also that was sometimes just off season. If we wanted to go work out, we had to have a sponsor in the gym or in the weight room. So he'd go in there and work out with us, and that way we had the sponsor. And then also with that time together, there was also a lot of conversation, of course, and I learned that he's a very perspective kind of guy. We would say one thing, and then oftentimes he'd say, but what about this perspective? And we were often trying to look at the world, look at different ideas from different perspectives, different events from different perspectives. So I thought today would be a good idea. It would be a good idea to bring him here and kind of talk about things from different perspectives and trying to find value in different perspectives. Sometimes we tend to attack, or we're almost taught not to look at the world from a different perspective. We're taught this is how the world is, nothing else. And then when we see someone from a different perspective, it tends to cause a little bit of, I don't know, anger, almost like, are you saying my mom was a liar? But anyways, the point is, today we're going to talk about different perspectives, and I just kind of wanted to talk about first, because one of the big political things is liberal versus conservative in America. And how would you define those two different terms?
It's tough because like your mind immediately goes to the definitions you've heard as opposed to maybe the definitions you kind of maybe feel are true. And then we were talking about bias earlier, and even in defining those things, I feel like it's hard not to bring bias. So I guess if I was trying to go from a dictionary standpoint off the top of my head, I would say, or even just the roots of the word themselves, liberal means kind of freer. Mm-hmm. And so I think you maybe see that with maybe a more, I hate to say more accepting, because again, that gets maybe into some bias issues, but just kind of less strict dogmatically with maybe the way things should be, and more open to newer ideas. And it's also tied with progressive movements. So the idea of like keeping society moving forward, as opposed to maybe a conservative would look at, well, we like things the way they were, and would like to see a more traditional way that things had been in the past, and why do we need to get so far away from that? Is that maybe a fair way to divide the two without being too biased?
That's a good way to put it. Sometimes I'll say conservatives are saying, if it's not broken, don't change it. And a liberal saying, but we can do better, so let's change it. So don't just do it because we've always done it. And then, there's a little bit of a different perspective in there. And I think both of them have wisdom to it. You kind of talked about a little bit, and I had to Google the definition recently. Because, you hear liberal, and you'll hear it in different capacities. For example, apply the glue liberally. Or apply it conservatively. And
right, because words have meaning outside of politics.
Yeah. So you know that there's, it can also be referring to quantity, but also it can be referring to viewpoints such as liberal ideologies or ideologies. I call them ideologies because I feel like ideology makes it sound like idiot idea. So I call it
which may be appropriate at times too.
Yeah, because I think we all have ideologies.
Absolutely.
But the point is, when I hear, obviously they can mean different things, and English is obviously one of those languages where that happens all the time. But I Googled the definition of liberal because I'm just like, you always hear this concept of liberal, but what does it actually mean? So I Googled it, and I'm sure the definition is not perfect. People have different definitions. That's why I asked you what your definition was. But it basically talked about how they're open to new ideas. And then, if that's the case, then I would be considered a liberal.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so, but I would also be considered a conservative because I do have convictions, and I say, this is what I believe, and I'll stand on this hill, or I'll die on this hill. So that you have two different sides. I wouldn't say I'm 100% conservative, let's do the same thing. If that was the case, we would still have slavery.
Right, so progress.
Yeah, we needed progress. So in some cases, we have to be more liberal in the sense that we have to be open for change. But at the same time, we need to be careful to just change everything.
Right. And then what are the consequences of some of these changes? And maybe you want to change this area, but what are the repercussions of that maybe we haven't considered? Yeah.
Exactly. So I think good discussion is very helpful in this case. I'll find sometimes, and I want to be balanced in my mockery, so sometimes I'll find conservatives, they'll say they're conservative, which means that they have they value things that we've always valued, but sometimes it's ignorant because I'm like, that's not a conservative value. That's your value that you're placing as a traditional value.
Right, right. Or other people have convinced you this should be part of your worldview, even if it doesn't have anything to do with how you maybe started looking at things.
Exactly. And I would probably be identified more as growing up conservative. So I have many conservative values, but at the same time, like I said, I'm also very open. And I find it would be difficult to respect someone who isn't open-minded to some extent.
I think that's probably fair. And if someone's too entrenched and not willing to change their mind with new information, then maybe there's someone I don't want to listen to for too long, or will get frustrated with, I guess.
Yeah. For example, if we were having a discussion and we were both very much set in our ways, then what's the point of the discussion?
Right. We're just talking at each other.
Yeah.
We're not actually listening.
Yeah. So that's kind of a good point that's a good side of maybe liberalism. The idea, maybe not always the people who identify with the idea.
Or their agenda.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes I find, and of course there's extremes on both sides, but you'll always hear the extremes more.
And that's part of the problem. And even even the term, I feel like, again, being in the state of Kansas and in a conservative community, even that label becomes used in a derogatory way. And so someone who's open to new ideas is this other person you need to avoid because they're going to corrupt you in some way. And it just feels, I don't know, I was talking to someone else about this the other day, the idea of drawing these lines and saying that these people are in that camp and we are in that camp, and we're not even going to listen to them. We're just going to assume that they are wrong, and evil is a strong word, but we just want to just have nothing to do with them or their ideas, and la 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 la, and then we're going to be corrupted in some way.
Yeah, it reminds me of, since my fiance, she's Filipino, so I know that in the Philippines there's like thousands of different dialects. And I wondered about that one time. Why are there so many different languages? Of course, there's different islands, but someone who was talking about Papua New Guinea, which is very similar, lots of islands, they said the reason there's so many different languages, I think they have the most different languages of a country, is because one tribe hated the other tribe, so they're like, we're not even going to speak their language. So instead of going la 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 la, it's more like, let's teach our kids not to understand them at all.
That's even why we have different spellings in the United States, though. We dropped the U in color in neighbor that you have in Britain. That was a concerted effort of the United States to be different and have our English be a little different. So we actually took those U's out of words like that. And there's a few other changes that don't come to mind immediately, but it was a concerted effort to separate ourselves from the Brits.
That's interesting. And probably even just driving on the other side of the road.
Well, cars weren't invented until after we left.
That's true. England was trying to be different. We invented
what side of roads did they drive carriages on? I don't know.
I don't know. That's a good point. But yeah, I think even in maybe in Russia during the Soviet Union, I think they made the red light for go and the green light for stop.
Oh, I hadn't heard that one.
I'd heard it
just to be different than the West.
Yeah. It was something like that. I can't remember exactly. But yeah, it was just be different. We don't want to be like them. We don't like them. And yeah, that's just a terrible thing because there is so much value in learning from one another's perspectives. And I think we often miss those things. And I talked about extremes earlier. We often hear about the extremes. We're not going to hear about someone who's just doing the normal liberal thing or someone who's just doing the normal conservative things. We'll hear about the extreme conservatives maybe going, beating up people for wanting to change something, or the liberals beating up someone for not wanting to change something, whatever it might be. We're always going to hear those extremes. And as a result, we're going to want to distance ourselves from it. So for example, a conservative right now, hearing of all the things, I don't know if the riots are necessarily all more liberal followers, but generally that's what we're told. They tend to be more democratic states and stuff like that. So I know a lot of conservatives that's not my crowd. Too extreme for me, and I'm sure the Democrats or the liberals looking at conservatives in certain times, they probably thought the same thing. We try and distance ourselves, but when I hear these extremes, a lot of times people who claim to be liberals, I'm like, you don't fit the definition of a liberal.
Which is kind of what I wanted to come here in the first place, is that maybe you put a face to this scary concept.
Yeah, exactly. That's the crazy thing, because people, and I know there are liberals out there, but I've probably met very few.
More than you think. That's kind of the point, I think. You look at a state like Kansas. You look at watch what happens this fall. You're going to see 30 to 40% of the people vote for the liberal side. And so that's a third of the population of the state you live in. So even if it's if it goes, red in a big way, there's still a significant chunk, even in the most, split state. And that goes the other way too. And, a state like California is going to have 35% of the people voting for the
Republican.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so exactly. There's always going to be more than we think. And usually when we're talking, for example, I didn't even know you came from like a different viewpoint than me until recently. When I posted something.
Yeah, I DM'd you after a Facebook post, I believe.
Yeah. And then I found out, like, I had no idea. And I think a lot of times that's how it is. We talk to people, we talk about similarities, and we don't even think about the differences until maybe something happens. So obviously there's a lot more in common that we have, even though we may be from different political viewpoints, stuff like that. And I think that's something important to know. But with the extremes, a lot of times people are saying, yeah, I'm liberal, so therefore I'm open-minded, but I don't want to hear your perspective. I'm like, well, that's not
and that's been
liberal.
an issue on college campuses. With, not necessarily the cancel culture thing, but basically they don't want to have speakers on campus because they don't want to hear an idea they already know they disagree with. And even very liberal comedians have gotten frustrated by that, because if they're not going to be completely politically correct, the colleges don't want them. So yeah, that's an issue on the left about the further left, that maybe the right sees it as it's lumping all the left with the extreme that doesn't want to hear those ideas, when there's actually a center left that's like, well, yeah, I'd like to hear those ideas, and I don't think you should prevent someone from coming and talking at your university.
Exactly. I know here at this church, the senior pastor, which is my dad, he often talks about there's two ditches. You want to be on the road, but if you go too far to the right or too far to the left, you're going to end up in a ditch.
That's probably correct. That's probably a good way to put it.
Yeah. So he's always talking about this balance, not necessarily the yin and the yang kind of balance, but more of just stay somewhere where you're not too extreme in either way, because too much of something good or bad can be, of course, bad.
And I think part of the problem that I think something to be aware of is, continuing your metaphor here, is that the people that are in either ditch are looking at the people on the road, and they're basically saying, the people who are in, kind of on their lanes but on the road, hey, the people in that other side of the road, they're in the ditch too. You need to get in the ditch here with us where it's safe.
Yeah, get on our side of the ditch.
They're trying to get everybody off the road and say, if you're in the center left of the road, you're actually really in the ditch. Or if you're in the center right of the road, you're actually in the ditch. And there's most people are on the road.
Yeah. I think a majority would be somewhere on the road. Maybe they're far right or
they're
far
like
left.
tires slipping.
Yeah, they're probably hitting those vibrating things or something.
They hit the rumble strips.
Yeah, but at the same time, most people, I'd say, would probably be on the road. I remember I was talking to someone, and if you were just to hear American news, you would think we're all a bunch of crazies. Especially right now with everything that's going on, you'd think that we're always at each other's throats, but you and I aren't at each other's throats.
Right. A lot of that's, again, the media is a whole slippery topic, but they are selling, at the end of the day, the media is selling advertising space, and this conversation doesn't sell.
Yeah.
But what does sell is the people in the ditches that are literally waving, banners one way or the other, and it sells. It sells advertising space to be more divisive, and that's kind of where we're at, and that kind of forces people who would otherwise be in the middle to pick a side of one of the ditches. Like, well, yeah, I'm not really in the ditch, but if I had to be, it'd be this ditch. And yeah, it's a problem.
Yeah, and I find a lot of times we're given almost an ultimatum: support this or support this, but you can't do if
you're
do
not
either.
all the way here, we don't want you at all. And you see that a lot on Twitter, especially where a lot of liberals get attacked for not being liberal enough.
Yeah. And I've heard that, and that's kind of where I say a lot of liberals aren't as liberal as they think, because liberal, the definition is supposed to be very open-minded.
Right, and they almost go so far to the left that they've cut off that very open-mindedness that maybe led them to the left in the first place.
So you often see, for example, like I have heard liberals attacking liberals for not being liberal enough. You'll probably hear conservatives attacking conservatives for not being conservative enough.
You hear the term, rhino, for Republican in name only, as a way to they're not really Republican because they're not Republican the way I am. It's like, well, you don't get to define what how they view themselves if they say they're Republican.
And I've hearing, of course, the news is obviously going to tell us the extremes, but I'm often hearing people being mocked for it. For example, racial things such as if a black person is conservative, it's often seen as bad because you're supposed to be liberal. And I'm like, that's not open thinking. That's you're telling someone what to think. That's not
You're
open.
telling someone how they should believe based on their race.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think we talked about it on a different video. I didn't show you that video. I sent you a different video. But the conversation we were having dealt specifically with culture and how sometimes we confuse how we look with what we do.